So thank you so much, David, for that warm introduction. Thank you to La Trobe and to RDI for having me here. It's really been wonderful to learn with and from so many of you in this room over the last day, and I'm very much looking forward to the day to come. And so, excuse me. So in that first day yesterday, we heard quite a bit about leadership, of course, given the themes of this conference. And it strikes me that there are a lot of models of local leadership, a lot of different models of local leadership that at least I think I heard over the course of the first day. First, there's a kind of model where we can imagine a local leader, this being country representatives negotiating with a development partner, right? This is an IMF bargain in the West Indies, right? There's also, of course, the model of donors providing funds to representatives of developing countries, of recipient countries, and thinking about those grant and loan arrangements as interactions between local leaders. And there's also, of course, plenty of environments where we can imagine local leadership, where we can imagine community leadership, and there's no donor immediately present. There's no donor in kind of our stylized image of the case. But increasingly, I would say, and quite frequently, there is some sense of reporting. This is a picture David very kindly framed in my work with a nonprofit in East Timor for a number of years. So this is my co-founder and then leader of the nonprofit we ran in Timor, filling out donor reporting forms after a training, right? And most interactions, most kind of community-led interactions that have some aid component are going to have some reporting component. And that sort of reporting, those structures of management and accountability in the way we normally talk about it, are where kind of this talk takes off from, and how it seems to me organizational structure on the aid agency side connects most clearly to what is possible and not possible for local leaders in a number of spaces in the developing world. So now let me take you here to East Timor. To Liberia. This is the view out my window. You were just in East Timor, you know, you've traveled not very far at all. So this is the view out my window in Liberia about a decade ago when I was the aid management advisor to the Minister of Finance there. And I should say I took this picture not because a decade later I thought that I would, be using it in some kind of presentation. I took this picture because the windows had just been replaced. And thus they were clean, right? And I thought I should take a shot of, the view out my window before the windows, frankly, got so dirty that I couldn't see clearly outside anymore. But as I look out this image now, there are a couple things that strike me. So first is there are a number of things around which, I don't know if you can see this, yes, I think you can, around which I can put circles, and we can imagine development projects working, right? So here in the top right, is a building that had been destroyed during the war, I should say. So this is immediately post-conflict Liberia. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is the president. This is a kind of reformer administration emerging from war. Here in the top, at the top, is a bridge that had been destroyed during the war. We can imagine a donor project that sought to rebuild that bridge. Here on the left is a window that is dark, even though it's in midday, right? That's because there's no central power grid in Liberia at this time, right? We could imagine a project that might rebuild that power grid. And one of the things, this is the Ministry of Transportation responsible for the traffic light just in front of it. There are no working traffic lights in the country at this time. We could imagine turning the lights back on. And what I'd like to suggest is for these kinds of projects, for rebuilding a bridge, for rebuilding a power grid. The way we conventionally approach development assistance might work quite well, in fact, right? So having clear plans with clear deliverables and benchmarks might allow us to drive things towards the results we seek. But of course, we all know that many things, I might argue most things, that are going to be critical to post-conflict Liberia, I can't put a circle around in the same way, right? We could turn on the lights in the ministry that way, but what about turning on the energy and capacity of the people within, right? What about all the kind of questions of capacity building, of state capability, of access to justice, of all the other sorts of things where we can't sort of put a circle around an observable, verifiable, countable set of things. So the other thing that often occurred to me when I sat in this room was that for all of those kinds of projects, we tended to manage them. I tended to see donors manage them in quite similar ways. And so I wondered, when are those management structures working and when aren't they? And second, it seemed to me that some of the people working for donor agencies who seemed to be doing the best work seemed to spend a lot of time fighting the institutions in which they worked, right? A lot of time managing up to kind of the compliance culture that they saw. And I found myself wondering, well, how generally true is that? And what is going wrong, in my view, inside the organization that's leading to this kind of dysfunction? Is it going wrong? And if so, what is it? That's what I sought to figure out. So look, I don't think it's an easy choice. You know, if you're sitting at the top of a donor organization thinking about the balance between top-down control and bottom-up management, there are no kind of easy decisions. This gentleman on the right, who, by the way, I'm not in any way related to, right? This is not a more attractive cousin of mine. You know, the words above his head are in Turkish. Does anyone speak Turkish in the room? Any Turkish speakers? Good, excellent. That means my translation can go on, unchallenged. So my wife is Turkish, and so this translates to spit up, you hit the mustache. Spit down, you hit the beard, right? And what I mean by that is you have to act, and no set of actions has no costs, right? So if we navigate from the top, if we use kind of tight top-down controls, we're going to get management control, we're going to get oversight, we'll get standardized behavior because we'll be able to get dissimilar people in dissimilar places to do similar things, right, using those controls, so we'll get more standardization. We might get more extrinsic motivation, where and when we can accurately kind of use pay for performance or those kinds of techniques. But we're going to get distortions of performance measurement. What do I mean by distortions? Well, first I mean what economics would call a multitask problem. So that is to say, if you have somebody and you want them to do some things which you can measure well and some things which you cannot measure well, if you measure the things you can measure well, you will get more of those things, but you will get less of the other things. People will invest in the observable and not invest in the unobservable. That comes mainly from the work of Holmstrom, of Nobel laureate Thomas Holmstrom and collaborators. In addition, Nobel laureate Jean Tirole and Philippe Aghion tell us that if we don't give people close to the ground the power to use what they learn as they're engaging in practice, they will not invest in gathering the information the organization needs, right? So we talked about organizational learning. Juliet just alluded to it just a few minutes ago. Of course, for an organization to learn, someone in an organization has to learn. Then we can think about sharing, diffusing knowledge, et cetera. But if I have a job, even a job I care about, but I know that making the costly investment to figure out what's going on in nuanced ways, in ways that are full of soft information, things I can observe but can't verify, can't codify, if I'm not going to be able to use that information, I have no incentive to gather it. Even if I really want to learn what's going on and make a difference, if I can't affect the project I'm working on, I might as well just sort of sit at home and play, I don't know, Angry Birds is probably too dated, but there's probably a new version of same. And of course, we're also going to get just less flexibility and adaptability because when we control from the top, it's going to be much harder for those closer to the ground to adjust things along the way. On the other hand, if we navigate by judgment, right, if we empower those closest to the ground, right, and I should say the data in this book is very much about those closest to the ground who work for aid agencies, but I very much think that the argument extends to nonprofits, to local leaders who are implementing development funds and non-development funds. We're going to get more agent initiative. We're going to get more use of that soft information. We're going to get more flexibility. We might get more intrinsic motivation because people like having autonomy and feeling like they can make a difference in their jobs. But we're going to have to rely on fallible agent judgment. And I think we should take that seriously, right? So that is to say, in development, I feel there's often this kind of image that the reason we might not want to trust agents is because of, the American expression is waste, fraud, and abuse, right? Because we might have bad agents who want to do bad things. I don't think that's very frequent in the world as it is, but I do think that human judgment is inherently fallible anyway, right? So, behavioral economics is arguably an entire discipline set up to think about all the ways that well-intentioned human judgment often goes awry, despite the best intent. I suspect if each of us thinks about the last few days of our lives, there is some judgment you have made that, despite being well-intentioned, was inaccurate, right? You were late to a meeting, you forgot to get coffee, you didn't wash your socks, something along those lines, right? We all try to do things, we all make judgments and make mistakes. Human judgment is fallible. And if we rely on people, we're going to have to accept the fallibility of the judgment that they steer with. So look, you might say, okay, I'm kind of hearing you so far, Dan, but why aren't organizations doing this correctly anyway, right? So 8 agencies have been at this game a long time. If there is kind of a balance to be had, why is that balance not going to be in alignment already? And I have kind of 2 basic answers to this. So the first has to do with kind of the nature of being a public agency and the nature of authorizing, right? So when we measure, when we standardize, when we codify, we do it not just to improve performance, of course, but also to demonstrate performance. And when we do it so that we can justify our agencies, justify our funding, right? We tend to overuse metrics even where we ourselves don't think that they're likely to be useful in actually helping deliver the project that we're trying to deliver. And the second reason is more general, right? So if you buy my story so far, then there are 2 kinds of errors here. There's an error of too little control and an error of too much control, right? The error of too little control is going to mean that agents have discretion, have autonomy that they use and sometimes make mistakes using. And we're going to see those mistakes and we're going to be able to adjust against them, right? On the other hand, the error of too much control means that the rules are going to prevent people from doing good things they would have done but could not do because the rules got in the way. So in expectation, that's going to be invisible, right? We can't see the good action that could have been taken but wasn't taken. And so as a kind of natural feature of organizations, we're going to focus more on the error of too little control than the error of too much and end up with too much control as a result. So what does this add up to? Well, I argue that most organizations are going to err on the side of too much control more often than too little. And that's going to be more true for more insecure agencies. By that I mean agencies that spend more time justifying themselves to authorizers. I see a few vigorous nods in the crowd. I appreciate that. I appreciate that feedback. And also, I think this is going to vary by kind of the sort of environment, the sort of task we're thinking about, right? So the more unpredictable the environment, the harder it is to figure out what's going on using sort of tools of top-down control, the greater the returns are going to be to this navigation by judgment. And the less the task can be pre-planned or effectively managed using numbers, the more we're going to see returns to navigation by judgment. What do I mean by that? I mean, building the bridge versus building the justice system, right? So, and the difference between those 2 kinds of tasks. So here's kind of that stylized theory, right? So as things get difficult, as we move to the right on the graph, it's going to be harder for everyone, right? But the agency that uses more navigation by judgment, the agency that puts more control in the field, is going to be better able to adjust to those more difficult circumstances. So to test this first, as David very kindly alluded to, I use the tools of economics. I build sort of a big data set to think about the sort of relationships between autonomy and performance in this way. Navigation by judgment and performance. So I build a data set of 14,000 projects across 9 organizations, across 40 years, across 180 countries. I can talk more about the data and where these data all come from in Q&A if folks are interested. For the kind of students in the room in particular, let me just say that data from 8 of these 9 donors are now on my website and available for download, clean data that can be used for a variety of research projects and future use if folks are interested. Those projects span the globe, right? It's probably a surprise to very few people in this room that when you look over a 40-year period, aid projects are kind of everywhere except a handful of rich developed countries. And what do I find? Well, I find that agencies that engage in that have greater levels of navigation by judgment see much less of a difference in their performance as environments become more unpredictable, right? So when the going gets tough, those agencies that have the person sitting in the driver's seat actually have control over the wheel are better able to adjust. I'm a Detroiter, I'm sorry, I always need car analogies, I apologize. So, are better able to adjust to kind of the rockier road, right? But those agencies that are trying to control things from afar are unable to adjust as effectively to those more difficult environments. And this result is driven by what I call less verifiable sectors, right? That is to say, it's not building the drip irrigation system where we see this. It's agricultural water management, right? It's not building the road, it's administration of the transportation system, right? It's nuanced policy tasks where we don't have sort of the ability to collect accurate, good numbers about what's going on. So, okay, great. You've shown me some stylized relationships. What does that mean for what's actually going on? What's driving this dysfunction? So to kind of explore that, I also do case studies. So I do 8 case studies in the book. I'm going to talk just very briefly about 2 of them, looking at municipal government capacity building projects in South Africa from USAID and DFID about a decade ago. So first, let me just say that looking at how folks at USAID and DFID talk about foreign aid, talk about projects, it's clear that political authorizers matter differentially and linked to reporting, that we see this kind of chain all the way down from insecurity, right? So in South Africa as a whole, there are 13 mentions of Congress and 1 of Parliament. And when I asked a research assistant to come up with this number, I have to be honest, my first reaction was, in maybe 80 interviews in South Africa, actually don't remember anyone saying Parliament. Who brought up the word Parliament? And the answer was, I did, right? So there was somebody who had worked for South African or for implementers of both USAID and DFID projects, and I asked this individual, look, you keep talking about Congress, you keep talking about reporting up, surely it came up, surely when you talked about DFID, when you talked about the UK, Parliament came up at least sometimes. And he says, no, not really, People didn't really talk about it, but there wasn't kind of this dominant talk about reporting to the UK Parliament. And then he finishes in this way I find so incredibly spot on, which he says, but the US aid is always about the Congress wants these numbers because they are providing so much for South Africa, and they want to know what is it that we have done with their money. And what I love about that expression is, of course, if I gave somebody a bunch of money, I would want to know what they had done with my money too. The trick is, if you buy my story, that the act of figuring out what happened to the money sometimes undermines the actual accomplishment of the money. And thus, even the best intentions. So I think we often talk about providers as if there is not an earnest intention to make aid work. There can be every earnest intention in the world, and it can still be counterproductive sometimes to manage in kind of a top-down controlling sort of way. So USAID, just to frame it a little bit, I imagine many of you have had exposure to USAID, but for those of you who haven't, it is kind of a classically insecure agency. One of its former heads, Andrew Natsios, described it as suffering from obsessive measurement disorder, which he yeah, good. And so, yes, and you should look up the piece. It's a great piece. So he defines obsessive measurement disorder as the mistaken belief that things can be made better by counting them, right? In the interviews, I see people talking about numbers adding up to meet arbitrary goals. Somebody else describes USAID as an agency under siege for going on 30 years now, and these interviews were about 7 years ago now, so I guess about 40 years now, right? And what happens when you're an agency under siege? Well, it makes you cautious. Of course it does. If you thought your boss was breathing over your shoulder, you would make sure to dot every I, cross every T, take as little risk as possible. Chris is nodding because, you know, Chris has to think about other Chris, and so he experiences this phenomenon firsthand. And so, no, I'm entirely kidding, just to be clear. You know, oversight, too much oversight makes one cautious. And so now let me talk just for a minute about those two projects, right? So these are two projects in South Africa, as I said, that seek to help municipal governments work more effectively in the kind of sense of like expenditure management, control of corruption, you know, revenue systems, revenue planning, et cetera, things like that. But USAID and DFID, despite these projects being almost exactly the same size, being in the same broad geographic area, being over the same time period, and having essentially, I would argue, interchangeable goals, go about what they do in very different ways, right? So USAID runs a project that works through training visits, right? So trainers come out from the center, they go, they provide day-long or half-day-long sessions, in some cases 2-day-long sessions, and then they come back. Whereas DFID hires advisors who are embedded in communities for a number of years, for usually 1.5 to 2 years, and work with and in the kind of local government structure in a way that is much more kind of, is at least much more potentially understanding of how local governments function and how local leaders in those communities are in fact operating in practice, right? And as a result of these two differences in styles, there are very different control mechanisms here. They're very different reporting mechanisms. So, you know, for USAID, so I filed freedom of information requests with both agencies, with both governments. And as a result, for USAID, I can tell you quite a bit, right? So on this day, what's today, the 13th? Is that right? It's good. So on a day like June 13th, let me make sure I get the year right, 2008, 2009, 10 years ago today, if that was a work day, I could tell you if anyone went anywhere. If they went somewhere, I could tell you how much the tickets cost if they flew, or how much they filed for mileage reimbursement if they drove, right? In some cases, I can tell you how big the room the training was held in. There was some concern about fraud, right? So how big the room was held in. In some cases, I have pictures. In some cases, I have the lunch orders, right, that are put forward for lunch. You know, yes, in at least one case, somebody like drew a map of their route because they deviated from the optimal route because of a traffic jam for the mileage reimbursement. And so I can tell you more about this hypothetical training, you know, or a training that happened in this project, then I can tell you about how I got from the hotel to this room this morning, right? I can tell you almost everything we might want to know, except, of course, whether anyone learned anything, and whether anyone did anything with the things that they learned, right? On the other hand, for DFID, I can't tell you much, to be honest. So the way this worked is that those embedded advisors did kind of inception reports, right? Then they were asked to report against those inception reports. And at the end, they said whether they'd accomplished what they set out in the inception report, right? So, you know, I teach university students, right? This is kind of the equivalent of saying to my students, why don't you compose the test, right? Take the test, and then tell me how you did on the test that you wrote and you took, right? I want to argue that this is not a very tight form of control, right? So I am not very worried that the DFID project has too much control, and I'm not very worried that the USAID project has too little control. And so I think of this as a nice stylized case for comparing these sorts of relative extremes in the same place to the same goals. All right, so after all that setup, what's the delivery here? How do the projects do? Well, you know, the USAID project, according to the deputy chief of party, that's the deputy head of a implementing agency in USAID language, argues that the project might not have made the most dent or impact. One of the trainers, and this is typical of the trainers, talks about the training is not contributing much. You go there, you don't have any authority. If people don't cooperate, you can't say anything. That language of cooperate I find quite meaningful, quite illustrative as well. And you know, let me say that, you know, as is almost always the case when I talk to folks associated with the business of development, I found the folks who worked for this USAID project, I could be wrong, of course, but I found them lovely, earnest, well-intentioned people, right? I don't think that these are folks who set out to spend years of their lives doing something that they themselves did not find meaningful at the end of the day. Much the opposite, in fact. And so, while I think this is from a kind of aid effectiveness standpoint, clearly problematic, I put it more on the kind of dimension of tragic than foolhardy, right? I think it's quite sad that folks spent years of their lives trying to work towards a goal that they themselves do not think that they've served at the end of the day. On the other hand, the DFID project is sometimes, but by no means always effective. Relying on people's judgment means that people make different judgments. It's also possible in some circumstances it would have been difficult for anyone to make impact. It's hard to evaluate those kinds of things, right? But what I can say at the end is that the projects are sometimes effective. When I go back to the communities in which these projects happened, over and over I had to remind folks of the USAID's project existence. It was kind of like oh yes, you mean the project that, and I'm like, no, that's actually a different project. That's not the one we're talking about here. But on the different project, that never happened, right? So because everyone remembers their advisor and the time they spent in the community, and they could talk about what they did, or in some cases didn't do effectively in their time there. I end up agreeing with actually DFID's own report. This is, in fact, one of the only cases in which I agree fully with the donor's assessment, which is that successes are linked to good judgment calls, and that although uneven in parts, the project includes some highly positive examples in selected municipalities. So I'm going to call that comparative success for DFID, but let's think about what that means as comparative success. It's not comparative success because it always worked, right? If our model is we are never allowed to fail, this project is a failure. It shows that in some places there was no effect of the advisors, right? But what is the comparison, right? The comparison is USAID project that never succeeded, but set itself up in such a way as to not find out that it didn't succeed, right? So which one of those things is better, and which world would we like our aid projects to live in, is the question that I think we need to grapple with. So you could say, look, this is a bad design. USAID should have done something different. I want to argue that, while of course many other things could have been done inside the envelope of the possible, a project like DFID's would not have been possible for USAID given their authorizing environment at the time. So USAID indicators are chosen because they're easier to count, but the numbers don't tell about the impact. An implementer describes it as a numbers game. We want the numbers, we want the information. It becomes even more number chasing towards the end because we need to reach our targets. And this system where we think that what it means to be accountable, to have accountability, is to deliver on quantitative targets, means that it would have been almost impossible, I want to argue, for DFID to engage in the kind of project that USAID, for USAID to engage in the kind of project that DFID did in this case. So results in sum, right? So in 3 of the 4 case study pairs, I think navigation by judgment works better. I think it works better because this is a stylized account of that. Red is DFID, blue is USAID. I think it works better in part because we see evidence of flexibility, of adaptability, but also because we see more ability to use that soft information, to use things that people perceive but can't verify in steering projects, and because there's more organizational learning, right? So if you are never able to use your judgment, you are never able to figure out where your judgment has led you astray and improve your judgment. Like anything else, we talk about PFM systems this way. I think it's true for judgment as well. They are muscles. We need to exercise them to make them stronger. And I think that's true for organizations as well. Here's the stylized theory graph I showed you at the beginning. And here are those quantitative results. And I want to argue that these 3 pictures essentially add up to one image. That image being one in which political authorizing environments can induce suboptimally conservative behavior that constrains field agents, one in which output measurement is a key tool in this constraint, and one in which navigation by judgment is contingently beneficial, right? It is beneficial under some circumstances which happen to persist, to pervade quite a lot of the time, but by no means all of the time when we think about development assistance. And kind of stepping back, organizational structure and bureaucratic incentives matter in aid delivery, right? When we talk about implementation challenges in development, for some reason that seems, at least in some communities, to implicitly frame in implementation challenges of the implementer's organization or the recipient's organization, right? Our agencies, our NGOs, the groups we work for, also have implementation challenges, also ought to be thought of as kind of organizations with structures and rules and constraints. So my view is that aid has the most power to be transformative in fragile states. That's where it's most likely to shift not just levels, but direction. And if you share that view, it's perhaps particularly troublesome that the logic of this argument is such that we could imagine, I think those navigation strategy errors are particularly frequent and particularly consequential in those fragile states. So where do we go from here? Well, first, I think we need to ask ourselves the question, when a focus on measurable results undermines actual results. I have to confess, I am by no means an expert in the ways of DFAT, but I did notice that DFAT's performance measurement framework is called making aid count, yes? So the question is, when is making aid count and counting in aid at odds with each other? When are those things in tension? And I think we all have a role to play here, and in many other ways as well, but I suspect we've all been in rooms where somebody said, look, this isn't a perfect measure, this isn't a perfect target, but it's the best we've got, so let's go for it. And my argument is, if we've got a perfect measure, right, if we don't feel the impulse to say that, fair enough, right? Maybe that's a good way to steer. But where we do have that impulse, let's think about whether the best measure, where it's not a very good measure, is better than something else that is radically different. The second best need not be adjacent to the first best, right? It might be all the way on the other side of kind of the what we measure paradigm, the what we measure spectrum. Second, I think we need to think about not just changing the rules of the organization, but changing the kind of plumbing of aid organizations, right? So there was some reference yesterday in the keynotes and in a couple of the panels to the notion of sort of demotivation, right, based on kind of management structures. And I think that's something we need to take seriously. What does it take for people to take risks, for people to bet on and use their own judgment, for people to not feel that doing the work that in many cases called them, that in many cases brought them to the sector, is at odds with the kind of career incentives that they face. I think we need to take kind of the nitty-gritty HR, procurement, accounting kinds of systems much more seriously than I think we tend to. We also might want to think about, and in the context of a conference focused on local leadership, actually shifting decision rights. So my conversation so far has all been about what happens inside the bounds of the organization, right? Who has control inside the people who are all working for or using funds of, right, DFAT or the kind of donor. Susanna Campbell, in a recent book, Global Governance and Local Peace, talks about how peace-building programs in Burundi end up being more effective when people close to the ground actually shift real veto rights to the local communities, right? When they say, okay, we can't figure out what exactly is the best way of doing this, so we are going to essentially rely on the community's judgment to figure out what's going on. The trick in her story is that this happens without the knowledge of headquarters, right? So this is all about a system in which it looks to headquarters as if the aid is being controlled by the field agents of the agency, but in fact, it is not. But if indeed this kind of shift is sometimes better even for the agency itself, right, then that seems to me to provide a kind of window for pushing a bit farther on who can control, on who actually has power in these discourses, in these dialogues. And finally, I don't think we should let a move towards navigation by judgment, a move towards flexibility, a move towards power in the field, be framed as a move away from real accountability, right? So real accountability is what helps get the job done in a way that delivers the most benefit, that delivers the most, to use an expression I know DFAT uses as well, that delivers the most value for money, right? So let's think about what that term means rather than how it's often instrumentalized, right? What maximizes value? And if the delivery of aid in a particular way leads to more value, then it cannot be contra greater accountability for the funds, I would argue. More generally, I think we need to think about when accountability, I have a paper with Lant Pritchett that came out a few weeks ago about this, that when accountability is about counting, is about accounting, right? And when instead it's about making account, when it's about justification, when it's about dialogue. What I heard from both of the brilliant keynotes yesterday was a vision of accountability that was very much about discourse, right? So Fiamme was talking, I heard at least, very much about a kind of community, an intersubjective community that exercised account, right? And Srilata, I was quite taken with the imagery of the group of, it was the shoulder, the group of women who were on her shoulder here, who came from the community organization as she went to the Ford Foundation, right? And she talked about the dialogue with those women, right? About being able to say to them, what kind of action have I taken, and is that good action? That is an accountability entirely divorced from accounting and entirely about making accounts. So I want to press a little bit beyond the argument in the book itself in light of some of the things I heard yesterday that really made me think about this argument. So, one is, this is an argument that is instrumental. That is to say, it says aid organizations can get more of what they want by doing things in using more navigation by judgment at times. But what about when when local leadership is not instrumentally useful for aid agencies, right? So part of the discourse that I heard, at least, between Srilata and a questioner in the audience, now in the 8th row, right, was this kind of dialogue around, the NGOization of the sector, right? So the NGOization of movements. If that's the case, that seems to me to be an example where what seems to be good for individual projects, right, may be bad for the sector as a whole, for the chances of kind of broader social transformation, right? And in thinking about when local leadership, when thinking about when the shifting of decision rights, when thinking about when more navigation by judgment is appropriate, I think we should think about when more navigation by judgment is appropriate and when it is more useful for aid agencies themselves in the current kind of paradigm they live in, but we shouldn't confuse ourselves that those two things are identical. It might be useful even when it is not instrumentally useful, right, in social transformation and broader social goals. And perhaps even more problematically, when would local leadership be good for a project, but actually bad for broader social goals? And so what do I have in mind here? Well, one of the things that, at least to me, emerged in particular from Srilata's talk was the notion, and indeed it's embedded in the, is it IDM? The IDM measure that is one of the sponsors of this conference, is the notion that we see inequality, we see power, we see patriarchy reproduced within organizations, within families, right? If that's the case, when is empowering local leadership going to help projects, but in fact not serve broader social goals? To me, that seems like an unanswered question, as does the question of who gets to make these calls, right? Do we think that those providing the funds should play any role at all in this dialogue, should play any role at all in making those decisions? And if they do, how do we expect them to make those decisions? I want to argue that both of those are questions of judgment, both the whether, and if we decide yes, then the how, the when, the why. Who steers and in one direction is not only a question of optimization, it's also a question of oughts. It's not just about economics, it's also about ethics, about judgment. And judgment is exercised by people, right? Organizations, we seem to sometimes forget, I sometimes forget when I talk about them, are collectives of people. And when we talk about what organizations do, we need to remember our own agency, as Srilata so movingly reminded us last night, to change the structures that we work in and around and with. So before I stop talking, or at least stop talking in this continuous matter, let me just close here at the cover of the book. You know, people say, at least I hope this works in Australia, people say don't judge a book by its cover. Is that something you think? All right, good. So I'm totally okay with you judging this book by its cover, were you to choose to do so. You know, this picture, this image is of a memorial in a town called Gloucester, Massachusetts in the US. It's the place where the book and then the movie The Perfect Storm are set, if you ever read or saw that. It's a whaling community in which people go out to sea, and very tragically, some of them perish. I should say it's now really a fishing community, no longer a whaling community, of course. And some of them perish. And that is tragic. And we mourn them, and we build statues to them, and in my mind, all of that is entirely appropriate. But what we don't do is say that because they exercised judgment and failed in a kind of ultimate price sort of way, what we should do is remove the capacity to make judgments from that whole class of actors. No one thinks that because sometimes fishing boats capsize, the right way to steer the fleet is to have a center on the land, GPS trackers on the boat, right? And treat it like a kind of drone video game. We know that the best way to run a fishing fleet is to have the people who have their hands on the wheel be the people who are actually on the water, the people who are actually in the situation. So why am I talking about fishing? Well, you know, I think this is a fine illustration of the notion that judgment fails. Of course judgment fails. The question isn't, is judgment perfect? Judgment is not perfect. If we rely on human judgment, there will be failures. The question is, as compared to what, right? So fallible judgment is not, I think, appropriately set against perfect metrics, perfect top-down control. Fallible judgment is best set against fallible top-down control. And the question is, which and when are each of these two ultimately fallible, broad strategies going to lead to better results? And my argument is that in the conduct of international development, in the distribution of donor funds, in the management and execution of nonprofit work, we would do well to use more navigation by judgment, and that might steer us more successfully towards our collective goals. Thank you. So let me start with the question of what makes agencies more secure, right? And what can make those agencies secure. So, you know, it strikes me quite frequently that I see aid agencies, and I think I've seen this in many different countries at this point, are often even more insecure than their authorizers intend, right? So that is to say, rules are written, constraints are given, and then agencies operate within those constraints. Thank you, Georgia. Agencies operate within those constraints, but in an even more constrained fashion than originally intended by the authorizers, right? So the easiest solution is just to open up channels of dialogue that let us at least get back to the intended constraints of those who are doing the constraining, right? So that is the lowest hanging fruit of becoming more secure, is to stop making ourselves even more insecure than the agencies themselves intend. And that means a system where it's okay to ask questions. I have no idea how it works in Australia, but I've yet to run into a system in which those receiving grants, those executing funds, feel perfectly comfortable saying what is actually allowed. And those at the agency feel perfectly comfortable asking legislators what is actually intended, right? What are these rules meant to mean where they are incomplete, which they almost always are, right? Life is more complicated than the written rules of regulation. More broadly, I think we need to my kind of broader solution is that we need to have a different kind of conversation about what development assistance is and does, right? My view is that when the public and authorizers have a very thin view of what aid accomplishes, that is not entirely unrelated to the fact that AIDS advocates have tended to use very thin images of what aid does. When a new representative, let me go to my country, so when talking to incoming new representatives in the US, right? When they have views like, isn't all aid just about vaccinating children and feeding people, I have to say, well, that's totally fair, because the images to which you, as someone entirely unconcerned with the sector, have been exposed could very well lead you to believe that that is indeed what aid is about. I think we need to have a broader discourse with the public and with authorizers as agencies, one that seeks to establish trust and that leaves all sides a little bit more vulnerable, right? A place where what we don't seek to be is as defendable as possible, but instead to kind of engage in a more sort of collaborative, discursive forms of accountability. To the question of NGO subversion, and I have to say, in this case, I missed the speaker's name, which perhaps is appropriate, given that it's a question about NGO subversion. So I guess it depends what we mean by subversive, right? So I am not an advocate, I want to be very clear for the record, of misuse of funds or in some way not following contractual agreements to which one has agreed, right? I think it's much better to kind of change the contracts than expect people to do good work by putting their lives, their organizations, their careers at risk. That said, it strikes me that NGOs collectively have a voice, right? So I was struck, Juliet, when you were talking earlier, you described ACFID. ACFID is the acronym. You described ACFID as the peak NGO organization, right? And one of the nice things about a peak is it has a tip. And it strikes me that that tip can be used to kind of pierce the common understanding of what NGOs can and do much more actively than it is sometimes used for. Collectively, NGOs have quite a lot of ability to shift the conversation because, of course, those providing the funds, donor agencies, rely on them to actually do the implementing. And I think that collectivization of the NGO sector, common conversations, open conversations between the NGO sector and funders can help us kind of rebalance where we are. So how do we steer once we're on the boat? So first, I have to say, there's no analogy I am not happy, no metaphor I don't want to go deeper on. That's just my personality, so thank you. Thank you for bringing me back to the boat. So how do we manage the crew, right? So it really depends what we're trying to do. Navies historically work through what are called mission orders, right? So they have broad orders. You sent out a boat in the 1870s or 1930s, right? You couldn't manage it in a very controlled sort of way, right? You had to set it out on a kind of broad set of mission objectives, and then let folks figure it out along the way. One thing about those mission orders is they don't necessitate a more collaborative governance on the boat itself, right? So I think embedded in your question is the insight, which I think is a very, very good one, worth maybe surfacing, that just because the donor allows an implementer flexibility does not mean that that implementer will always engage in kind of collaborative onward delegation of autonomy. The opposite is true, right? If the implementer is constrained, then the implementer has to constrain downwards so that they get the information to report up. But if the implementer isn't constrained, well, that leaves open a lot of possibilities. So first, I do think there's a lot more work to be done here, and I look forward very much to reading your work when it comes out. But in general, I think the question of whose voices we listen to and how we think about sort of staff norms, right? How we think about whether we're all on a kind of common journey or not is an important question. And I also think that accountability structures as we traditionally understand them can be embedded inside that journey. So, in one of the more successful projects for USAID that I look at in the book, this is a project of the Office of Transitional Initiatives, which is one of the more flexible parts of USAID, which focuses on humanitarian and transitional affairs. The OTI representatives and the chiefs of party sit together in an office, right? My notion is not that only the people with certain job titles have unique access to soft information, to judgment, right? And sometimes the more people we get experiencing the same reality and deciding collectively, the more we can kind of allow that flexibility for steering the vote in a variety of ways, and for collectively holding the rudder, which I suspect you think is part of the answer, and I do too. So the question about academia, I have to be honest. So I know I've been doing only a mediocre job of repeating the question. I realize only at this point. I'm sorry about that, David. So, but Kieran, you ask about navigation by judgment inside the academy, and I think that's right. That many people, not all, but many people join the academy or work in universities because they believe it is work that's intrinsically meaningful to them, because they care about the goals of seeing young minds become vectors for change, right? Of helping young people see the success they want to see. And I think that there are some echoes in that way between the development sector and the academy itself. In general, I think that systems that think that impact, when what the job is a quite nuanced activity, right? The notion that impact can be best or solely codified using a kind of metrics-based approach, right? I think has a lot of problems. I do think that doesn't necessarily mean, and I think this is true for development as well, abandoning the numbers. It can mean that. But it can also just mean changing how we use them, right? So, can we use information, can we use quantitative information as an input, as one of many streams of understanding what is going on in the world, rather than as the answer to the accountability question? And it does seem to me that in some countries more than others, the academy has moved in that direction as well. But I have to confess, I'm not an expert on internal academic politics, nor I feel I'm going to be disappointing here. Am I planning a forthcoming book on the topic? Though I look forward to reading that book once you write it, Kieran. So I look forward to forthcoming 2022. Does that seem about right? Yeah. So cheers. So thank you, and I would love. Let's do another round of questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does navigation by judgment differ by culture or political culture? Yes, yes, certainly. But I think there's lots of variation within cultures as well, and over time, right? So, I've given you a static picture of where agencies were at a particular point in time, but agencies in their life cycle become more and less independent, more and less subject to political constraint. And that's because politicians change and political culture changes, but also because actions of the agency change relationships. People get, a reputation for excellence, for example, right? That then gives them more slack, the kind of earned autonomy idea in the UK. But the notion here, of course, is that earned autonomy may have it slightly backwards, and that there might be a whole range of places where giving more autonomy as an input is likely to lead to better outputs as well. But yes, varies based on more factors than I could possibly codify and systematize in this kind of study. The relationship, actually I'm going to punt on adaptive management and come back to it. So the role of contractors. So the risk of seeming a bit silly when you have a contractor, you have to write a contract, right? A contract needs to fix things, it needs to write things down, it needs to have reportable targets, et cetera. There's a whole literature on the notion of when you want to be inside the bounds of the firm and when you want to be outside the bounds, right? What's sometimes called the make versus buy problem. When do you want to make it as an organization? When do you want to acquire? When do you want to buy? And one of the basic logics of that argument is that the more it's the case that you are uncertain about what is going to happen, the more you want to be in a make world, right? That a buy world forces you to pre-specify things that might not be advantageous. And I think we see this across a range of tools. Implicitly, DFAT, I am sure, and many other aid agencies use a range of different kinds of acquisition and contracting modalities where things are more fixed, the more certain the task, the more certain the environment. There's already a recognition of this. But I do think that the more we contract out, the more, even if the private contractors are equally well-intentioned, we fix things in space and time, particularly if we can't be adaptive. And so that's why I wanted to go the other way around, because it seems to me that relates to this question of how we think about how this relates to adaptive management. So, the answer to what you do on the boat, right? The second question, first question from the first round, is also a question about how you steer once you have the kind of ability to do a range of things, right? And one of the things you could decide to do is engage in adaptive management or problem-driven iterative adaptation, for those for whom that's a phrase. I once heard somebody introducing Matt Andrews, who's a friend and who I have a lot of respect for, say that all of the words in problem-driven iterative adaptation must be important because otherwise the acronym would be much better, right? And so I thought that was a great line. It was at ODI actually, to give credit where credit's due in the UK. I think you can then choose to engage in those kinds of management practices, which I think are entirely appropriate in a broad range of circumstances. Another way of taking your question is, why invent a different concept, right? Like, why have new language for something like navigation by judgment? To me, because kind of how we set up the organization is a different question from how we manage the project. One's maybe strategy, the other's tactics. But at the end of the day, frankly, I'm all about whether the cat catches the mice, right? So if this kind of discourse, if this kind of data is useful as a tool for advocacy, as a tool for change, that's my interest, not the name on the label, personally speaking. I think, yes, we see tons of judgment in top-down systems. I think it is hidden, though. We pretend it's not there. We pretend we have a facade of objectivity, right? A patina of kind of, of sort of truth mountain, because we've used numbers, because we've used data, because we've used what we can quantify to describe it. And I think there are many scholars who've pushed on this idea, the notion of thinking about the judgments that are embedded in our choice of metrics, right? That's also a part of, I keep getting it confused in my head, IDM, is that right again? I think that's embedded in IDM. How do we think about the judgment inherent in metrics? And many other kinds of questions. I think independent evaluation is almost never fully independent. I agree with you on that. I don't think that makes it a farce. So that is to say, I think there can be degrees of independence. Whether we want independence to mean disassociation from project teams is, I think, another question, right? Independence is often interpreted to mean outside observers who act as kind of external auditors of projects. But as somebody who used to be chief of staff to Minister of Finance, external audit has its place, but far more valuable in correcting behavior, I would argue, is internal audit, right? Are the auditors who work for and with you, who engage in a dialogue, who engage in account, not just accounting, and speak, of course, to the public, but speak primarily to the agency, to the implementers, to help them think about how to move forward. What enables and disables navigation by judgment? I would say there are the things I talked about, political insecurity, legislatures, organizational, parliamentary structures, et cetera. But there's also leadership, right? Leadership of agencies, leadership within legislatures, leadership of civil society communities and activists. And I think there's a lot more to say about that, which I'm very happy to talk more about offline. How do we work in environments of corruption? I'd start first with the also possibly too obvious statement that we already do, right? So that is to say, how do we navigate by judgment in environments that where maybe not all actors want to push in the direction we would like to see them push? So first, by the way, I don't think everything that we call corruption is a sign of bad intent, right? So when I worked in the Ministry of Finance in Liberia, one of the things that struck me over and over again was how people who had been put in the ministry specifically to loot the ministry, right, by Charles Taylor and his associates, could, under bounded conditions, change what they focused on in ways that were productive, right? So first, I just want to tease apart the idea that because we have acts of corruption, we have bad people who can't be trusted. I don't think those are coterminous concepts. There's a lot more to be said about that, but I'll just leave that there. If we're talking about bad actors, right, and there of course are bad actors in the world, how do we let them navigate by judgment? Well, we don't, right? But how do we figure that out? We do it by evaluating their use of judgment, their use of discretion, right? I would say we take small bets, right? Some of those small bets are going to go wrong. But I don't think that the answer is we fear some malfeasance, so we pull everything back. We, I think, far too often set up our management systems so that they minimize the bad actions of the worst person rather than amplify the actions of those who do want to do good work. And I've yet to find anywhere in the world, any ministry, any office, right, from the Customs Department of Somalia, where I've done some work, right, to the Ministry of Finance in post-conflict Liberia, to the military in South Sudan, all places where I've spent time thinking about organizational structure. I've yet to find a place where there are not well-intentioned actors, at least some well-intentioned actors, who want to do good. And I guess that's my model of the world. And so to close, this question, the last two questions, which I'll take together, would very, very nicely ask, how do we move forward, which make clear what was kind of in the background, which is that, of course, there is power inside this political economy, right? And there are those who seem to benefit from the power. Let me say that I would be the last person to say that there aren't power dynamics. Indeed, I just said there are, but I think I have been surprised myself at the reaction, the way you framed it, Danielle. I've been surprised myself at the kind of openness of the reaction. So I thought I was going to write this book, and then I was going to spend a lot of time running around and talking to people about this diagnosis and arguing with the kinds of folks I think you both have in mind about what this evidence said. But what I find, not universally, but far, far more often than I ever expected, is that people agree on the diagnosis. And when I say people agree, I don't just mean people who work for the agency. I don't just mean people who work for implementers. I don't just mean local leaders who have to deal with these structures. I also mean the people who run the agencies and the people to whom they report, right? When I talked about this work, Chatham House rules, so I won't individually attribute, but when I talked about this work at the World Bank Executive Board, when I talked to the executive directors of the bank, more than one executive director said something along the lines of, yeah, I know these are super flawed levers, right? I know the levers I can pull are not the best levers for getting things done, but I sit in this chair, and these are the only levers I have, and I have to demonstrate that I am doing something active, right? I have to demonstrate that I have some control. That is to say, maybe this is not true of all of you, but I think before I wrote this book, did not realize how often the people who seem to be in positions of power themselves feel beholden to a system and recognize the kind of centrality of the problem. And so, what do I think the way forward is? I've lots more to say about this, but maybe step one is start having more open conversations between different layers of the system about what this collective dysfunction is and how we can take small steps, how we can, perhaps do pilots, right, that let us see. We talk about piloting new technology all the time. What about piloting new management? What about piloting new ways of organizing? And how can we try, learn, and grow? How can we adaptively manage? How can we learn from experience as we think about organization, as we think about management as the kind of object of inquiry? And perhaps I'll stop there. Thank you for all these very wise questions. Thank you.